Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of I Came for Science, a show about sex and reproduction and inclusion in STEM. I'm your host, Laura Surratt. I'm a professor of biology, and I've been studying animal sex for the past 30 years. Please join me as we normalize talking about sex and what we know about it, as well as the journeys of the scientists who study it. Today's episode builds on our last episode, which was about queer family building. In this episode, we consider reproductive losses that occur along that journey. We are joined today by my colleague, Dr. Christa Craven, who is a professor of anthropology and women, gender, and sexuality studies at the College of Worcester. Christa is an expert in the area of reproductive losses, especially as they impact queer families. She's the author of a book entitled Reproductive Losses, Challenges to LGBTQ Family Making, and another book entitled Pushing for Midwives, Home Birth Mothers and the Reproductive Rights Movement. Christa, I really appreciate you joining us today.
Absolutely.
I'd like to start by hearing about how you got interested in this topic of reproductive losses.
This was not a project that I thought I was going to take up. And it's actually a great example of what I often talk about in my ethnography classes about serendipity and things happening that are out of your control, that move you in particular directions. So my initial research when I was a graduate student was on home birth midwifery. And so I've always been very interested in reproductive health care, reproductive justice movements. This topic became a very personal one because my partner B and I lost our first baby, and it was an experience that nothing prepares you for, and you are kind of forever changed by it. And I say that particularly as a queer couple in a rural area. There weren't many other people who had similar experiences. One thing we found was that once we had experienced, it was an 18-week miscarriage. Once we'd experienced that, lots of people shared their own stories of miscarriage and stillbirth, which was really powerful. But we still didn't know any queer people who had that experience, and you start feeling like, well, gosh, are we the only ones? We looked online, we looked for books at the library, things like that. And one of the things I found when I was doing that research was a survey by a psychologist in England, Elizabeth Peel, and I took the survey, as someone who had experienced, a queer person who had experienced a loss. And at the end, it has the kind of typical, if you want to learn more about this research or hear more about it, and so I put my information in. Well, I got an email from Dr. Peel, and essentially it was saying, well, I saw in your signature, your email signature, that you are a researcher, and I see that you do research with reproduction. Is this an area you're doing research in? And that they, as a primarily quantitative researcher, were really interested in partnering with someone who would do interviews, with people in the LGBTQ community who had experienced loss. And I was absolutely not ready for that research when I got it. I think it sat in my box for months, my inbox. But eventually I reached out to her and, really started a collaboration that has gone on now for more than a decade, where we did some work together, but she was also the editor who worked with me on this book in the series that she was editing. And so it became a really great collaborative experience, which I think, particularly with work that is difficult, and as researchers, we so often don't talk about that, like the emotional toll of research. It's really helpful to have another person or other people who are going through that research process with you and who understand the tolls that hearing those kinds of stories, transcribing them, continuing to engage with them, what kind of toll that takes emotionally.
I'd like to dive into the topic of reproductive losses now. And I was wondering if you could describe what you include in the sort of realm of reproductive losses. What are different types of reproductive losses?
Absolutely. And you'll notice the title of the book is Reproductive Losses. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that losses are always multiple. They always bring up things from your past that you have lost. Oftentimes losses compound in terms of of the ways that you experience grief and other emotions. But also, when I started to work on the book, I thought, primarily kind of coming from my own experience about miscarriage and stillbirth.
Mhm.
But as I got into it and I started reaching out to, particularly some of the midwives I'd worked with previously and other reproductive justice activists, I started to hear about a variety of different types of loss. One being adoption loss that gets very little conversation. In most US states, the birth family or the birth parents have the right to reclaim for a certain amount of time. So some places that's 24 hours, some places it's a week, some it's a month. I talked to a number of people who had experienced adoption loss and so had, children who were in their care and, for some all the way into a month and a birth parent reclaimed. And oftentimes that related to homophobia. One example was a gay male couple who I spoke with, the birth mother who they knew quite well. They had been to, OBGYN appointments and had been with her for the birth and planned to maintain a close relationship with her. She did not want to reclaim the twins, but her ex-boyfriend, who had been abusive, but was the father of the children, came back into her life and said, "I don't want faggots raising my baby." Oof. It was just heartbreaking the way in which that story unfolded, and the relationship between the men ended up dissolving, and again, losses, right? Like the multiplicity of losses, I think, is a really just an important thing to be thinking about in terms of queer loss, but in terms of loss, more generally.
What is, like, through your own personal experiences and through your research, what's different for reproductive losses for people who are LGBTQ from people who aren't?
So the other thing that folks said to me when I started out this project was, "Oh, great, you're going to show the universal experiences of, people who experience miscarriage and stillbirth, and how no matter, race, sexuality, creed, et cetera, it's the same for all of us." Right. And there's elements of that, right? There are definitely elements of that. Grief is experienced, in lots of different ways. But what I think really inflects the experience of queer people are the laws that are inequitable, the ways in which they are often treated, that, whether it be healthcare providers or friends or family saying, "Well, maybe this was for the best that because you shouldn't have brought a child into the world," or laws that, or policies within institutions. I talked with people who the non-birth partner was not allowed to hold the stillborn baby or make arrangements for burial because they were not family. And these laws, and policies in different institutions differ quite substantially. And so with so many laws restricting the rights of LGBTQ people, I anticipate that those kinds of challenges are going to increase rather than decrease. I mean, I think there was a hope that, when same-sex marriage was legalized, it's like all the problems would be over. But no, I mean, we knew that wasn't going to be the case, but I think the backlash that we've seen is even more profound in that context, and really inflects the experiences like reproductive loss that, are universal in the sense that anyone can have them, but the way they're experienced is, I think, is substantively different when you also face the political and social environment that we're in.
So that's how the challenges are different. What I was struck by in your book is, not to put a smiley face on this,
Absolutely,
but that there were different ways that people who identify as LGBTQ, not all of them, but LGBTQ, the people you interviewed, might have navigated through the loss because of this part of their identity.
Well, grief is an incredibly common emotion surrounding reproductive loss. There were also, I guess, a variety or a multiplicity of responses to reproductive loss. And so let me give an example. One was a couple, a trans man and a gay man, who, in their process of, making a family, had two losses. And so the first, when I interviewed the trans man who had been the birth parent, he talked about how the first loss was not as difficult difficult for him as it was for his partner. His partner had told, has told his mother, so, it was a first time grandparent. And there was a lot, I guess, riding on that, kind of legitimacy and that forming of a family together. But for the man I interviewed, he felt the loss showed him that his body worked in the way that he wanted it to. And despite having been on testosterone and being told at that time that, you couldn't conceive if you had been on testosterone, which is not true, for him, it was a relief in a sense, and kind of an affirmation of his body doing exactly what he wanted it to do, despite being told that it couldn't. But then the second loss that they had was very, very difficult for the trans man who was pregnant because of the doubts, the self-doubt that made about his ability to carry a pregnancy. Whereas his partner, who had been so invested in that initial, but this was just another step on the journey, right? It's a great example of how, even within a family, people can respond very differently to, I don't want to say the same experience, but to an experience that they're sharing together.
So going back to reproductive losses, we've talked a little about miscarriages and stillbirths. We've talked about adoption losses. What other forms of reproductive losses would fit within that term?
Another kind of loss that other researchers, Damien Riggs is one in Australia, who has done a lot of research on loss during the surrogacy process. So the surrogacy process involves an intended parent or parents, as well as a surrogate who carries the pregnancy. Oftentimes, it may involve gametes, sperm or eggs from, people who are the intended parents or outside of that. And so there's a lot of complexities that come into the surrogacy process. Just like any pregnancy, there is a chance of loss. We haven't talked about statistics on loss. I mean, there was a popular campaign a few years ago. It was called 1 in 4, and it was talking about how 1 in 4 women have experienced loss. Others say 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in loss. The bottom line is it's very common, right? If a quarter of people or a quarter of pregnancies are ending in loss, so in a surrogacy situation, it is just as likely, right? And so addressing the issues of loss for the surrogate who's carrying the pregnancy, for the intended parents who are waiting to have that child in their life. So I think that is a very complex kind of loss, and one that hasn't gotten a lot of study by social scientists.
Were there any types of reproductive losses that you did not include in your book?
There are two things that I didn't include when people reached out to me. And one of those was people who had experienced abortion as a reproductive loss. Now, I talked to multiple people who had multiple losses, and some of them saw their abortion as part of that. But many really strongly differentiated that between the experience of making a decision, having that agency themselves, versus the experience of a miscarriage or an adoption loss that was really largely out of their control. And the other group, and again, these are the kinds of things that they deserve a study of their own, but I didn't feel like I could do justice to, were parents, queer parents who reached out to me who had lost a child because of a split or a divorce with a partner. So the child, if the child were not biologically related to them, or they had not legally adopted that child, that the partner would not allow them access to that child. And that is absolutely a form of reproductive loss. Right. However, I didn't feel like I could do it justice in the same, in talking about that experience of losing a pregnancy or losing, a very young child.
another turn, if you're willing to go with me on this, of taking a cross-cultural perspective on reproductive loss. And I know that wasn't the focus of your book, but I know that you have expertise in cross-cultural understanding of human behavior. And so I was wondering if you could share with us maybe either kind of your outlook on cross-cultural perspectives on reproductive losses or some interesting insights that you've noticed.
What I would say was very interesting to me, especially when I spoke with people from different areas of the world about loss, were some of the different ways in which it was understood. I remember very clearly a conversation that I had with a gay man from China, and he was somewhat shocked that the research that I was doing, that it held so much emotion for people, because during the process of the pregnancy, his feeling, and again, this may not be every Chinese person's feeling,
Right.
but his understanding was that this was, a product of the woman. It was flesh. It was not a human, and it was not grievable in the same way as a human was. And that was really profound to me, because that's a very different understanding than most people in the US. And I think this is where it relates in interesting ways to discussions of abortion as well, right? Like, how far do you go? Is the egg itself, or are embryos human, right? Those kinds of questions that in the United States are just part of the vernacular. I mean, they are part of our conversation, and people have different feelings about it, for sure, but no one questions that someone's loss, even at an early point in the pregnancy, can be experienced as a loss. Whereas that's not necessarily true cross-culturally, and that people have different beliefs, about humans and or humanity, and about when and what constitutes a loss.
And I was struck by that in your book too, circling back to your own personal experience, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Of how people were it sounded like, really surrounding you and B with love, but especially focusing on you as the person who was carrying the pregnancy.
Yes.
About your experience of loss, and sort of ignoring B's loss in the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was true for a lot of non-birth parents. Actually, I would say almost all of the non-birth parents that I talked with. There was just, kind of a disbelief that it could impact them in the same ways. And certainly, a birth parent, especially who experiences a miscarriage or stillbirth, I mean, there are hormones that go along with that. My milk came in. I think that was one of the most difficult, physical experiences with the loss. But at the same time, when I talked with non-gestational parents, those who weren't carrying the baby, their hopes and dreams of that family were no less cognizant, or they were, no less important. And it was interesting to talk with people about the different moments. When I think about the moments for me, like I said, when my milk came in, that was devastating, and was as just, that physical experience really was just all encompassing. When I talked with people who were not experiencing those physical things, the anniversary of the due date of the child, the end, like thinking ahead about birthdays and things like that were much more salient. So different experiences with loss and grief. Sometimes gestational parents experience those things very differently. While the physical was incredibly important to them, some of the imaginings of family making, what birthdays were going to look like, those kinds of things were incredibly salient to the non-gestational parent.
What other things would you like to share with our audience about reproductive losses?
One of the things that was incredibly important for me in writing this book, and this was my second large research project, and I've been steeped in feminist and queer activism, but this book in particular, I really wanted to be useful beyond the academy. I wanted this to spark conversations and to be useful to LGBTQ people who experience loss. At the time that I was working on this, there really weren't a lot of resources. I think there are more now, but still, many of the resources assume a heterosexual couple and a very different, political and social milieu for the families involved. One thing I would want to say to people who have experienced a loss is to find other people who you can talk to. And sometimes that is physical and in person, sometimes that is online, sometimes that is picking up a book like this and reading the stories about other people's experiences. They may not map onto yours, but that in and of itself is okay. I mean, I think that seeking comfort does not necessarily mean commonality, that you can find that comfort in knowing the experiences of others that may be quite different from your own, but your goals were the same in terms of creating a family and having that really taken out of your control.
And I would say, as someone who identifies as heterosexual, that reading this book helped me better understand the experiences of others. And so I would say anyone who has loved ones who are forming a family, who are LGBTQ, this is an excellent book to read to kind of understand a wide range of experiences that people can have with reproductive losses. So.
Yeah.
Really
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And one of the things that, just even in terms of the way the book is structured, that the stories are set off by text boxes and by a different font. And I did that really strategically kind of for two reasons. One, because for some people who've experienced loss, it's very difficult to read other people's stories. So it makes it possible to read it, but not necessarily experience in depth the stories of others when a reader isn't ready. But alternatively, as an academic book, if that is of less interest to you in terms of analysis, you can also read those stories and find commonality with those stories and identify them very quickly as you move through it.
So what resources could we point our listeners towards who are either people going through such reproductive losses or people supporting those who are going through these losses?
So one is the companion website to the book. There is a lot of material that I made available there because not everyone can afford an academic book, which tend to be a little pricey. And so one of the things that I worked with several student assistants on is putting some of the advice. Everyone I interviewed, at the end of the interview, I said, well, what advice would you give yourself, going back, or someone maybe who's having a similar experience? And then I also asked them, what advice would you give to people who want to support LGBTQ people in the experience of reproductive loss? And so all of those answers are compiled on that website. And so that can be kind of an interactive way in a sense. And some of them conflict, right? Because not all of them are going to be the same.
Everybody's different.
But again, I think it gives you some really good ideas of different ways to, to support yourself, to find community, and to support others who are going through, a very difficult time.
I wanted to talk more about your professional journey. Were there specific experiences that encouraged or fostered your career as a scientist, as a researcher, or discouraged you as you navigated through? And did any of that intersect with your own personal lived experience or identity?
I think finding ethnography as a research methodology was incredibly important. I have always loved talking to people and learning about experiences that are different from my own, some that are shared with my own, but being able to learn about people's lives. And so finding ethnography and, as an undergraduate, getting the opportunity to embark on some kind of mini ethnographic projects. And then
can you define ethnography for our audience?
Yeah. Sure. Ethnography is a research methodology that really centers around participant observation. So it's not through a mirrored glass, observing someone else that you see in a lot of the social sciences, but participating yourself and also having that visceral experience of learning about other cultures and other cultural practices and beliefs. And part of ethnography is oftentimes interviewing, talking to people. A lot of people claim ethnography and say, a journalist will go and talk to people and say, oh, I conducted this ethnography of this group of people. When in fact, ethnography is a lot deeper than that. And it involves a significant amount of time. Usually it involves one or more specific locations. That's one of the things that was most difficult for me about this book, because because of my previous work with ethnography, is that there was not a place, not even online. People were experiencing reproductive health in different areas of the world, in different institutions, different homes, but that there wasn't a specific space that within which I could do participant observation. And so this book is primarily interview based. But again, a lot of those interviews took place in people's homes, and they went to the cupboard and they brought out, something that was meaningful to them about the experience, a memorial or cards that people had sent them, or things like that. And so when I think about my own trajectory as a researcher, social interaction has been incredibly important to that, because I feel like it is really the best way to learn about experiences that are different than your own. Just observing them doesn't allow you to really feel and really learn about the experiences of others. And so, I mentioned this in a different context earlier, hearing stories that are, and experiences that are substantively different than your own, oftentimes you can still find an empathy and a commonality through those. And I think about some of the most difficult stories for me, the most difficult interviews that I did were with people who experienced adoption loss and had children with them for multiple weeks or even a month. And those were the stories that kept me up at night and that really were very difficult. The stories that were more like my own, part of my own healing process had been moving through those issues in previous ways. And so encountering something that was quite different from my own actually really deepened my understanding and experience of thinking about reproductive loss and grief in a broader context.
Part of that context was thinking about the multiplicity of losses. So in this case, thinking about the losses that a birth mother experiences, as well as the intended parents who were looking to bring a child into their lives. This really helped me understand how losses were really intertwined.
And I'm wondering, how do you think your studies of reproductive losses in humans relate to reproductive losses in other animals?
The first thing that popped into my mind is that recent video that kind of went viral of the orca mother and the dead baby that she kept with her for,
kept bringing up to the top, right?
Kept moving it along with the pod and kept with her for quite some time. And I think grief is going to look different in different species, and grief may not even be applicable when we're talking about particular species. But I think there is something to be said for thinking about family making and all of the different ways that occurs among humans in different cultures, but also among animals, and how those experiences intersect with experiences like loss.
What occurs to me is that, like you were saying, that miscarriage is so common in humans, and it also happens either miscarriage or sometimes it's called spontaneous abortion in other species, and that not taking away from the loss, but normalizing that you're not alone, that this happens. And sometimes yes, I mean, I don't know if I would say it happens for a reason, but there are developmental problems going on with that developing fetus, or sometimes, like in other species, the environmental conditions or the social conditions are such that the offspring is unlikely to survive.
Absolutely, and among humans as well. Whether it be environmental, I think there's some interesting research in areas that have been really affected by war and all of the chemicals and metals, and the ways that those impact fertility and infertility.
In addition to the environmental conditions you're discussing, are there also social conditions that impact reproductive losses in humans?
Stress can impact reproductive loss generally, but I would say in particular with LGBTQ populations, some of the women that I spoke with talked really eloquently about how their experience of homophobia, particularly when it was people that were close to them, so, family, close friends, they felt like that contributed physically to their miscarriage, their not being able to carry a pregnancy. So when we think about splitting apart the social and the physical, there are ways in which it's always intertwined.
Absolutely.
And even recovery following a loss
Mhm.
can be prolonged by, negative responses, especially from people that you love. I remember some examples of people saying, family said, well, this child, wouldn't have come into a good family anyway, wouldn't have come into,
So like a lack of sympathy, a lack of empathy.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's hard.
Another type of loss that I spoke with people about was more related to infertility. So
Okay.
not everyone that I interviewed had, had carried a pregnancy or had had a child.
Mhm.
Some had experienced infertility because of medical treatments. So, for instance, treatment for cancer,
Mhm.
and they were unable to have children, after at least biologically after that time. Others going through the transition process. I talked with a trans woman, for instance, who had not had the option of sperm storage before they transitioned, and really had an incredible amount of grief about not being able to contribute biologically to forming a family. A lot of questions came up for people who had not been offered the opportunity to store sperm or eggs. Oftentimes it was questions about, what aspect of their identity or experience was it that impacted, particularly then when that was common medical practice. Was it because they were a butch lesbian? Was it because they were a single parent, or would have been a single parent? Was it related to race, and assumptions about, about women in their communities? And those are always unresolved, right? They're not the kinds of questions that really can be answered in retrospect, but the ways that they intersect and that they come up as aspects of the grief that someone is experiencing, I mean, it really shows the ways that those layer upon each other and become reproductive losses in that multiple sense.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I think I can speak for myself, and I feel like in conversations I've had that we don't think of infertility in the same category as things like miscarriage, but putting them together of, struggling to build a family in the way that you want to build a family and losing that ability in different ways. So in some ways you're losing a person or a developing person in your life, and in other ways you're losing that opportunity that you might have had.
Yeah, and that dream.
Yeah.
That when I think about reproductive loss, I think the most salient part for me is that it's involved in family making. And that's going to take a lot of different forms, across different human populations, different cultures, and, even as we were talking about before, non-human animals and their, experiences in groups. And I guess I would say the importance of the social interaction around it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's just been immensely informative and powerful to talk with you. I appreciate your contribution.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be on this podcast and very excited that you're doing all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening. Thanks also to our production team, Isabel Espinoza, Lane Patton, and Daphne Trilliana. The music used in this episode is from I Don't Smoke by the Mythical Score Society.